All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see you all here. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name is Mia Tuan. I serve as Dean of the College of Education. About 3 years ago when I joined the college, we started a new tradition called EduTalks. And since that time, we've become a bit of a national leader in this thing called EduTalks. Other institutions have copied us. So what are EduTalks? EduTalks are 5-minute, one-image talks that are not supposed to be about your theory of change, your methods. It's a story that you tell about what matters to you and the things that you care about. We model them after TED Talks, but with just 5 minutes and a purple rug instead of a red rug. And they're meant to be fun and engaging and a very different kind of talk than the type that most of you are being trained to do, which is a research-heavy talk. This is part performance, part musing, part storytelling, as I was saying before. Oh, goodness. I think it's the wind. So on the faculty side, I think we've hosted about 5 different EduTalks, and this is our first student-focused EduTalks. And the reason for that is because of 3 of your colleagues, Corey, Rachel, and Aaron. Give it up for them. I've been involved in putting on one of these things. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of coaching. It takes a lot of dragging and schlepping the rug, arranging the room, the food, and everything. So I really want to thank them for putting in the effort to do this. Okay, so I've got a couple of requests for you. The first is to hold your applause until the end of the speaker's turn. The other is to remember to be kind to our speakers. This is a stretch. It's a different kind of presentation than ones that maybe they might be used to. Plus, it's scary to stand on a purple rug and just try to perform and remember a 5-minute talk. Okay? All right, without further ado, our first speaker, Andrew Vo, the Vietnamese-American elementary school teacher.
I want you to take a moment and think about a time where a stereotype has limited your life. I think back to the moment when my mother was pregnant with me, the 2nd trimester. My parents were happy to name their child, their firstborn child. They decided to go with the name of Andrew. The reason was because my father had a friend who was a physician, and his name was Andrew, and while this may sound very stereotypical, he wanted me to become a physician as well. And so with that hope, here I am in education and not as a physician. This goes back into their cultural history and their ethnic roots. My parents immigrated to this country from Vietnam in an effort to escape the Vietnam War. Having everything taken away from them, the only way they were able to sustain themselves was through access to resources, and that to them was money at the time. In their eyes, if I always went into a profession that made a lot of money, I would always be safe, and if something traumatic were to happen to me, that I would be safe. Fast forward to when I was 16 years of age, this shifted a little bit. I want you to take a moment and think, when we observe the profession of medicine and the profession of physicians, who can go into these professions and not be questioned? Somehow, it's socially acceptable and never questioned that people that look like me can enter these fields. When we talk about elementary school classrooms, personally, I always think of white women as being the majority culture. People like me are not expected to go into this field, and it's often frowned upon at the cultural level from my own experience to even step foot into this profession. So what are the implications for students? When being trained to teach linguistically and ethnically diverse students, it's important to capitalize on their strengths, their funds of knowledge, and also to validate their lived experiences. Oftentimes, with a very whitewashed profession, this is problematic. I see myself in here during my time volunteering in an elementary school classroom in high school, where a student came up to me and was pleading for help. The substitute teacher at the time just failed to build a rapport with that student, and that's when I fell in love with education. Being an elementary school teacher, you're able to capture the lived experiences of your students and really make change. And so this was an urgent call for me. There is a need for diversity in this field and also the need for representation of people of color, specifically Vietnamese-American males as well. If we want to empower young people, I feel like we need to demonstrate to them that they can do it too, and I am an example of that. If we are going to empower youth, we can't just stay in the stereotypes that are put upon us. In fact, it's important to push back against those stereotypes that are put upon us. There's a lot of fear around going into this profession. My culture has conditioned me to internalize feelings that, oh, I will be a bad teacher. Our people don't belong there. Only a certain group of people are right for this job. Rather, if we're approaching this paradigm shift, I feel like there needs to be more educators of color, specifically Vietnamese-American, considering there is a high number of Vietnamese immigrants coming to this country that need to be educated and deserve to be educated equitably as well. And so when I envision myself in 2 years teaching in the classroom as an elementary school teacher, I think back to those moments that really mattered to me and how my teachers validated my lived experiences, never discriminated against me simply because of who I was, and pushed me to enter this profession because it's okay. Vietnamese people can be educators too. We don't belong just in one field. We don't belong in just one domain. We can exist across different professions and really make change in the lives of young people. And so I'll leave you with some takeaways. What stereotypes do you bring into the world and put upon individuals? What can we do to push back against these stereotypes? And in a world where where our heart should be in putting students first, what can we do to really give young people agency and not limit them because of stereotypes? Thank you.
All right, so Hitting the Wall, Social Emotional Learning Through Rock Climbing with Brian Carpenter.
Thank you. This is too hard. I'll never figure this out. I can't learn this. Why do I have to do this? Clearly, I'm not smart enough to figure this out. If you're a teacher, you've probably heard these comments from students, or you will hear them from students. It's only a matter of time. Every student hits some kind of wall in the process of their learning journey. For some students, those walls are relatively easily overcome. For other students, those walls loom very tall and very imposing. What if we had a really simple, really tangible, easy way of showing students that they could climb those walls? I would argue that we do have such a tool. It's called experiential learning. And I'm going to talk about the example of rock climbing. What happens when students hit the climbing wall? This last winter, I had the opportunity to be part of a program that works with high school youth in one of the alternative high schools in the Seattle Public Schools, and a local community organization called, well, the local organization is called the Mountaineers. The program is called the Mountain Workshops. And the program provides these students with an opportunity to learn about rock climbing. It's also a chance for them to have fun. These are students who face a lot of barriers between them and getting an education. Some of these barriers, some of these walls are constructed by systems like the juvenile justice system, or lack of substance abuse or mental health support services. Some of these walls, quite frankly, are a result of students' own internal constructions. What happens when these students hit the wall? I want to talk about one student in particular that I had an experience with that I think is a great demonstration of what can happen when students hit the wall and what they can learn. This doesn't happen with every student, and we certainly don't try to bludgeon them over the head with the climbing wall as a metaphor for life and getting an education, but hopefully most students can take away something positive from the experience. Now, some students when you put them on the wall, they require very little support, and they just go climbing right up without much pressure, without a whole lot of encouraging or cajoling or support. Other students seem to require a whole team of people to get them just partway up the wall. On one particular day, Michelle, I don't know if she was having a bad day or what, but she refused to participate in the group activity that we start out with. She did not want to participate in the team building activity. She just sort of sat by herself and stared at her phone. However, when she was given the opportunity later to climb on the wall, Michelle began to perk up. And I remembered that she had told me one time that she had won a science contest in school, and that science was her jam. So I encouraged her to think about climbing on the rock wall. It's kind of like a physics problem of opposing forces. Now, that particular day, we were encouraging students to try rappelling, which is where you climb up and then lower yourself down on a rope by yourself. And this is scary for adults to do, so it's obviously even more scary for many high school students. We do this in a very safe environment. We have multiple redundancies. The students are asked to climb up and rappel down a very short distance. And on this particular day, we were encouraging the students to rappel. Several students, including Michelle, were like, nope, no way you're going to get me to do that. That is crazy. Only crazy people do that. I'm never going to do that. But after one of their classmates went up and rappelled down, I could see Michelle was thinking about it. So I encouraged her to try it. And eventually, with a lot of support and a lot of help, Michelle climbed up and rappelled down. And as soon as her feet were on the floor, she started talking a mile a minute. Oh my God, I just can't believe I did that. There's no way I did that. I just did that. I can't believe I did that. Oh my God, that's crazy. I can't believe I did that. This went on for like a whole minute. She was just verbalizing what was going through her brain. And it was really, really important to see, because Michelle learned a really important lesson that day. She was capable of a lot more than she thought if she could push through her fears. When students hit the wall, they have an opportunity to overcome a lot of barriers to learning. If we had more students hitting the walls, I think we'd see a lot more barriers to education come crashing down. Thank you.
All right, an imposter among us, Josiah Gikungi.
Today we're going to talk about a very serious issue that affects millions of America all around the country, as well as millions others across the world, and poultry too, imposter syndrome. How many times have you walked into a room and immediately felt out of place? Now imagine feeling that constantly wherever you go. I couldn't help but feel out of place the first time I walked into Miller Hall and to my first ECFS classroom. Here I was, a cellular, molecular, and developmental biologist, sitting in a room full of educators, and I recall thinking, what am I doing here? I came upon ECFS at a difficult point in my life, where I was struggling with who I was before, who I was at the time, and who I wanted to be in the future. And as such, through the process of self-reflection and discovery, I found out that I have a passion and drive to work with children, and as such, a degree in early childhood and family studies felt like a step in the right direction. Now, what I did not know at the time was that I was about to embark on a journey that was very profound and will leave a lasting impression on me. Now, it's one thing to feel out of place, and it's another thing to look out of place. The College of Education is 83% female, and now just by that alone, I obviously stand out as a male. But then through the work of Marty Howell, we've discovered that I'm in fact the first African-American male in the CFS major. So what does that mean? So it means that I can't really skip class and get away with it that easily. But it also means that I had to find ways to rise above any barriers that I may face and succeed and rise up and be the best that I could be. So what did I do? I took this chance to answer every single question that I could in class, even though most of them were wrong, but this is how we learn and how we grow. I decided to get to know my classmates, who are some of the most wonderful people I've ever met. I decided to join ACE, where I have served as this year's Public Relations and Social Chair. All those multiple emails you guys have been getting this year, that was me. I decided that I wasn't going to let this hinder me and hinder my success. And that is what I did. I decided to succeed, and I did succeed. And I hope I continue to succeed. And at this point, I can't help but wondering, will others who come after me face the same challenges that I faced? Will they be able to succeed? Will they be able to rise up? And what can we do as a College of Education, as future educators, as current educators, to make sure that everyone else who has in the same problem that I had succeed? So one of the most, I don't have all the answers, but one thing that we can do is encourage cultural responsive teaching. Only through this can we make everyone feel comfortable. I have been lucky enough to have such brilliant minds as my cohorts and amazing professors who have been able to encourage discourse and discussion among very serious topics such as racism and equity without making me feel out of place, and I am really appreciative of that. One of my most favorite quotes is from the Dalai Lama, and it says, "Our primary purpose in life is to help others. And if you can't help them, then to not cause them any harm." And from the bottom of my heart, I would just like to thank the whole College of Education for taking me in and making me feel like less than an imposter and more like I belong. And will anyone who didn't belong in the College of Education have a whole notice board that they control? I didn't think so. So if you or a loved one are infected by imposter syndrome, please don't contact your lawyers. They can't really help you with this. But I want you to know that there is hope and there are resources to help you succeed. All you have to do is just find the right people to help you. Thank you.
Individualized education journey, Gina Tesoriero.
I recently transitioned from a career as a special education in New York City to being a graduate student here at the University of Washington in the Learning Sciences program. And although I miss my students immensely, I'll tell you one thing that I don't miss at all, and that's reading IEPs. IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. And although that sounds wonderful in theory, the idea that there's this document that outlines this specialized journey for students based on their interests and identity, that's not what IEPs ended up being. There were countless pages of what students could not do. One student in particular comes to mind, Mark. Mark's IEP said, Mark's knowledge of domain-specific language is far below grade level. Mark fails to follow multiple step directions. Mark is unable to recall details. What was worse, Mark started to subscribe to this can't thing, and he often sat in the sidelines of the classroom, reluctant to engage in activities, and often quick to tell me things that he was not able to do. However, what was not written in Mark's IEP was how amazing Mark was at creating community that ended up having a huge impact on his teachers and students in his classroom. The summer before I became Mark's teacher, I engaged in a workshop that taught me about design thinking. And I was challenged to bring in some activities to my classroom that engaged students in this type of work. The first activity that we did in a series around biomimicry and buoyancy was the plankton race. Children were challenged to create the slowest sinking plankton to optimize time for photosynthesis. This here is Mark's winning plankton. It sank 10 centimeters in 2 minutes and 50 seconds, which is super slow. And so this challenge had the ability to bring Mark in from the sidelines into center stage. And it really had an impact on him and his classmates. Because what Mark chose to do with this center stage, the spotlight that was on him now, was uplift his other peers and bring them in from the sidelines and help them use their strengths to achieve a success. This was Mark's superpower. He was an interpersonal genius. This amazing ability that Mark had supported him throughout his career as he prepares to graduate now in June. He hopes to, I'm so excited for him. So he has aspirations of being a counselor for students in his neighborhood. So what was it about this task that was so amazing for Mark? Well, it didn't have any gatekeepers or boundaries he had to cross to engage. He was able to engage without having to extract details from a text before he did a debate, or he didn't have to decode a word problem before he was able to solve it. He was able to dive right in with his abilities, and that allowed him to engage in these critical practices of perseverance and problem solving. But I had to ask myself, is accessibility enough? Shortly after that experience, I had an opportunity to engage in a fellowship where I learned about the democratic teaching framework, which taught me that accessibility was not enough, and that we needed to incorporate students' interests and identities into the classroom so that they were able to take ownership of their learning. So I started to ask questions that would help bring in stuff from outside of the classroom or other different range of abilities, like, what annoys you while you're eating or cooking? Or, how would you redesign the cafeteria experience? And the flexibility that was inherent to these prompts really opened up the space for learners to bring in a wide range of abilities and their interests into the classroom. And it started to dismantle some of the unjust power dynamics that existed in my classroom. However, once again, I had to ask, is accessibility and flexibility enough? Now that I'm here at UW, I'm learning about equity pedagogies, and they're teaching me that accessibility and flexibility are not enough. That what we need to do is create the space for students to enter in their path of self-realization and empowerment so that they can make change in their community. This path that I'm talking about, this individual education path that I'm on right now, has really helped me to reflect on my learning and to see how different experiences have contributed to the way that I act, the things I say, and the things I care about. My only hope is that every student has an opportunity to continue the path that was cultivated in creative environments that were built on accessibility, flexibility, and empowerment, so that they are able to realize their true genius, just like Mark was able to.
The Power of Preschool Inclusion by April Boyce.
Never underestimate the power of a preschooler. Whether it's with that adorable little grin, the infamous puppy dog pout, or when all else fails, that full-blown meltdown at the checkout line of a grocery store, preschoolers know exactly how to get you to buy them that king-size bag of special edition M&Ms. Now, preschoolers, both with and without disabilities, are highly capable of many other things. They can engineer the coolest block structures. They can perform Oscar-worthy portrayals of their parents in the Dramatic Play Center. And they can create the most amazing masterpieces with just a few tubes of toilet paper and a ridiculous amount of tape. But that's not all. Preschoolers also have the power to create a more inclusive world. Have you ever been in a situation where you see someone that's a little different and you just weren't sure how to start a conversation? Or maybe you've been that person that's walked into a room and you felt like an outsider. Well, all through history, people that don't fit the mold of what society perceives as normal have been ignored and excluded, much of that stemming from the fear of the unknown. Well, our lives could look much different if we took away that fear at a young age. If instead of just telling our kids not to stare at the person in a wheelchair, we teach and actually encourage them to say hello. Preschoolers really do have the power. They can change our societal attitudes about disability, and it all starts with high-quality, inclusive preschool. Now, inclusive education is the belief and vision that all children, no matter their ability, can access learning opportunities and fully participate in schools. The classroom is a place where differences are valued and all children are given equitable supports to successfully communicate, share, and play. But preschool inclusion, inclusive education, is more than just a place. It's a mindset. For educators, inclusion is about opening our minds to possibilities, making room for different perspectives, embracing new ways of thinking, and fostering a sense of belonging for every child along the way. Sorry, Mia. So, when a child with a language delays initiates a conversation using picture symbols, peers begin to realize that there's more than one way to communicate. When a child wonders why she doesn't get to sit on the squishy blue chair, but then notices that her peer with autism actually has better focus at circle, all thanks to said squishy blue chair, she begins to understand equity, that fair does not always mean equal. And when children find ways to include their peers of all abilities in their play so that no one gets left out, they learn acceptance and empathy. In high-quality, inclusive classrooms, teachers intentionally plan activities to meet the needs of all learners, so children are more engaged in the classrooms and more confident in their abilities. The higher expectations of inclusive settings ultimately leads children with disabilities to improved academic performance, increased social competence, and better friendships. In the long run, children with disabilities have better outcomes after high school, including meaningful employment and independent living. Now, research also tells us that even children without disabilities can benefit from inclusion. Inclusive classrooms provide typically developing peers with many opportunities to learn appropriate, effective ways to interact with their peers with disabilities. Because they're often our peer models, they have greater self-esteem and better leadership skills. When children without disabilities are exposed to inclusive experiences, they're more aware of individual differences, more accepting of diversity, and overall, they just learn how to be good people. As they grow to become good citizens, these peers play a significant role in disrupting the cycle of exclusion. So currently, in the United States, only 46% of children with disabilities ages 3 to 5 attend inclusive preschool. This means that a majority of our children are not benefiting from the outcomes I just mentioned. So clearly, there's more work to be done. Just remember, inclusive education enhances learning, leadership, and character development for all children. They'll grow up to become our future social workers, teachers, politicians, and civil rights activists of the world. Their inclusive mindset could eventually shift the negative attitudes of disability, leading to a more tolerant and accepting society. Yes, preschoolers really do have the power. So imagine living in a world where people are a little more thoughtful and a little more understanding, where every person, regardless of ability, is viewed for their strengths and not their deficits, where the term inclusive education is just called education. We can get closer to this as a reality, and it all starts with high-quality inclusive preschool. If we invest in inclusive education, we invest in all children, and we invest in a more inclusive world. Thank you.
Language learning, not just an afterthought. Davis Boswell.
Anyone who has learned or is learning a new language will tell you that the scariest moment is when you're in front of a native speaker and you have to combine everything that you've learned. For me, when I would go to Spanish office hours for my Spanish class, I would always prep exactly what I was going to say ahead of time to a T, and then I would prep exactly how my professor would respond to that to a T, back and forth, because that's how conversation works. And so I would get there, I would say my lines perfectly, and then my professor would do the worst thing possible and go totally off script. In my head, I'm like, seriously, I prepped for 3 different ways that this conversation could have gone, and you chose none of them. And so in this situation, I'm like my grandma who prints off the directions from MapQuest beforehand and memorizes them, and my professor is Siri who decides to take a different turn at every intersection. So I stumble through the next sentence. They switch into English because they just really want to get the interaction over with, and then I go home for 3 hours and think about all the things that I could have said. But lighthearted story aside, this was a really great learning moment for me. It's something that one of my favorite education professors calls, you don't know what you don't know. Before this, I didn't know how truly terrifying and intimidating it can be to speak a language that you're just learning with someone who's been speaking it their whole life, even if they're the nicest person in the world. And my situation was relatively low stakes. My health, my economic well-being, my safety, they were not threatened. And this is a privilege to learning a second language or a new language out of choice instead of necessity. And the K through 12 system, there's nothing to hold students accountable to learning a new language. I never had a personal or academic reason to do so. Where was I going with that? We know that children learn languages much better than adults and teenagers, yet most districts don't offer or require students to take language courses other than English until high school. And even then, it's only 2 or 3 classes. And we also know that it's much harder to unlearn a bias than it is to develop a positive mindset from the start. Right now, there's a very real trend among monolingual English-speaking students like myself to develop a subconscious dismissal and fear towards other languages. There's also a hypocritical expectation that everyone else should learn English and cater to us, even if we're the ones to go abroad. And we're seeing the effects of this today if you turn on the news, or I think we all know maybe a Chad or a Becky, and no offense to the Chad or the Beckys in the room, that have gone to Cancun for spring break, and the only thing that they bothered to learn was más tequila, por favor, y ¿dónde está el baño? Porque Becky ha tomado demasiado tequila. But I want you to imagine what might change if we were to start focusing and valuing and emphasizing language learning in the first few years of school instead of the last. We know that there's so many benefits to language learning. It improves cognitive abilities like critical thinking, problem solving, reading in one's native language, the ability to hypothesize in science. It prevents memory loss and cognitive degeneration as we age. But most importantly, it cultivates respect for the language that you're learning and its native speakers, no matter what language that is. Too often, language is used as a tool to divide, to oppress, to erase the ugliest parts of our history. But language, at its core, should be about fostering unity and genuine human connection. So it's time that us, the future and current educators, administrators, policymakers, redefine it so that it is not just an afterthought. Thank you.
Literacy in the World of the Real, Kevin Roberts.
So I used to believe that my job was to prepare students for the real world. And as a white teacher working with predominantly students of color, what separated them from the real world was a gulf of lacked experiences that only I could provide them. I was the white savior. But when we say these things about the real world and real experiences, what we're really saying is that the worlds our students occupy now are insignificant, and that the questions they have will just have to wait. For now, they're passive objects in a world with its own agenda. But an alternative exists, one where students engage in what Paulo Freire calls praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. The world, it could be that real world passive preparation, or it could be the students' world of the real, where we invite them to engage in interrogating their communities and their experiences through real questions and engage in real, but quite often uncertain, action to transform it. Brings me to this picture here. For 2 years, I lived in the basement of a writing center. It was actually a 100-year-old church. And when I moved out, the students moved in and immediately began to interrogate that space. I believe the question they applied to that world was, how could anybody possibly live down here? Upon reflecting on that question, they decided to act in order to transform it, painting the walls a color I probably wouldn't have chosen, but might have been a little happier 2 years if it was bright orange like that. So just a small example of students engaging in reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. But I want to talk for the rest of the time about my literacy classroom, where students read the word and the world, meshing text, community, questions, and action in the students' world of the real. So a few years ago, I was engaged in a novel study with a group of 8th grade boys reading the absolutely true diary of a part-time Indian. The question that they applied to the word, when they analyzed the text, was through, does race define us? They then turned that question on their own communities, and the classroom was on fire with discussion about systemically segregated neighborhoods, the stares and mutterings of white parents in the bleachers when they traveled for sporting events, and years of teachers with bias just like my own believing that they lacked experiences. These were no longer immutable facts of life, but issues worth interrogating and transforming. And the classroom, being positioned in their world, privileged their ways of knowing and ways of being to speak back. So in active literacy, writing is an author's active response to a question they have, writing as action. So the students decided that they too would write to their city council describing how in so many ways race and racial policies were defining factors in their lives. But with that plan, shortly after that, every single English teacher in the district received an email from our curriculum director letting us know that that text, the True Diary, was inappropriate for classroom use and that all copies needed to be returned. I decided to simply share that email with my students so that they could understand. And as we read it, we began to question whether calling the words they read inappropriate said the same thing for the worlds they were reading and the questions they were asking. But this decision was now a part of their growing world of the real, and it wasn't in us to just passively accept it, so we spoke back. More specifically, we wrote back. In a chain of open district-wide letters that found their way to the newspaper and the local university, I challenged the curriculum director's decision about banning the book, and this made a lot of people very upset. It brought a lot of attention into the classroom, but we were prepared for that attention, because when people came into the room to supervise or see what was going on, they were met with the students' own writing as action. Poster-sized letters to the curriculum director, her quotes, and their rebuttals. It was a turbulent couple of weeks. But when we adopt praxis in the classroom, there is no set curricular plan to follow. Different communities will have different students, different questions, different calls to action. But there are questions that we can reflect on as educators. What value are we placing on our students' lives as rich sources of content worth interrogating and acting upon? And as educators, are we willing to expand our understanding of the real world in order to work, learn, and act alongside our students in the world of the real? Thank you.
Translating talent, Kim Boudreau.
You got it. All right. So when I tell people that I'm majoring in both human resource management and education, I often get this look of confusion on their faces. And it's followed by the question, so do you want to be a teacher or do you want to go into business? I actually kind of love getting this question because it kind of gives me a chance to talk not only about something I love, but it gives me a chance to connect my experiences and how it eventually will lead to gainful employment. But what if I didn't get a chance to explain this? What if, let's say, I had a one-page document that a recruiter was going to look at for 20 seconds and push to the side after that? Does this sound familiar? Approximately, or as many as 60% of corporations nowadays are facing a leadership crisis. There are a shortage of there's a perception that there's a shortage of people that can go into these leadership positions, and they're desperately looking for creative ways to fill those. Oftentimes, the burden of translating a talent or translating the experiences that people have fall onto the candidate who is applying for the job. But what if the business took some of this from the candidate? What does this look like? Since we all have the commonality here of education, let's start with that. So as educators, what would make us valuable assets in a corporate setting? Number one, we would be the leaders in a company that focus on learning and development of our team. As we advance through a company, others advance through the company too. What about all of the stuff that we learn about unconscious bias within systems and organizations? We are equipped with the skills to not only address and mitigate, but even reverse some of the impacts that these companies who are really focused on diversity and inclusion desperately want. Beyond this, I think that's a good start, looking at broadened ways of looking at work experience and formal education. But what about all the experiences that you get outside of these settings? This is actually something that really inspired my talk. It was an article titled, "Why Good Parents Make Great Leaders." And it was a really cool article about this man's experience with being a manager in a company, then having children, and seeing what organizational leadership skills he developed after that. And to me, this was not only powerful in that you're broadening your view of how people get these leadership experiences, but it's putting a strength-based lens on how people view people's experiences. So instead of, oh, they became a parent, work-life balance became so much harder. How do we solve these problems? All these problems exist. It's about, oh, you became a parent. What new things do you bring to the company? What new things do you bring to our organization that make you a powerful leader? By a company taking the initiative and taking the burden of broadening the definition that they're making about leadership, they're not only broadening the applicant pool, all these new people that they can fill, all of a sudden solving this crisis that they're facing, but the diversity of candidates also increases. And as studies show, innovation and new ideas and heck, even just meeting your equal opportunity quotas. So at the end of the day, organizations who broaden their definition of leadership and accept more experiences and more viewpoints into a company are the ones who allow people to be their whole selves at work. Thank you.
Learn like a gamer, Michelle Davis.
Hey guys. That thing will rot your brain. I heard this a lot growing up as a kid. Of course, back then it was about television. But I find that my daughter still hears really similar things and revolve around her computer. She's on it like all the time, and it drives me insane. That thing is going to rot your brain. Okay, I'm an educator, and she's playing. And I know that play is how we learn. So what is it that my kid is learning when she's playing these video games? In every preschool and in most kindergartens, we accept that play is like this amazing way that kids learn. It promotes equity and it teaches kids how to share and all of these wonderful things. But as they get older, the more we tell them, shh, sit down. Memorize this, be tested on that. And they lose that motivation and that drive to actually learn and play with what they know. Okay, so if I know all of this and my kid's on the computer for hours and hours, what is she learning? My daughter plays Stardew Valley, which is a farming game where you actually are encouraged to go into the community on the video game and interact with people and make friends and maybe even get married. That's awesome. My kid is learning interactions and social connections. Okay, well, what else does she play? My kid plays League of Legends, which is a multiplayer, vast community of gamers that go and capture the flag of an opposing 5-person team. But so not only is she now connecting to people that she's never met across a broad range of countries, taking away her biases about who's a gamer, but that means she's also engaging in creatively coming up with strategies and critically thinking about what's the best way to take down that turret. Her favorite thing? Shoot it with guns. Okay. So how do we put this to use for kids and every day? To incorporate more games into the classroom in order to encourage them to be motivated to play and thus to learn. When I am in the classroom and I'm seeing all of these kids just sitting and listening and being very passive, it makes me feel very antsy. I'm like, no, we need to do something else. And no offense to Oregon Trail, but I'm not talking about edutainment. A lot of companies just don't invest the same kind of development that they do when they're creating games for a classroom versus actually engaging games that are fun to play. So, okay, how do I take this knowledge that I have about my kid learning games and apply it to what I know about being a teacher? So that means that we got to take games and start breaking apart what they learn and how that works. If I'm going to be teaching about the fall of the Roman civilization, oh great, well then I grab Sid Meier's Civ 5, and everybody gets to pick a civilization, and we go from Stone Age to Modern Age, and we pick apart what works and what doesn't, and who gets to survive and why. So all of this culminates, ow, that's really painful. All of this culminates into the idea that when you play video games, when you engage in a way that is memorable and tangible, then you are not only being able to cultivate someone's communication skills, but their creativity, their critical thinking, and their ability to collaborate with friends. So I encourage everybody to not just sit there and tell students, shh, sit down, it's my turn to talk, but to really get them engaged and motivated into play and thus into learning. Because as we go about our lives, more and more, we'll sit there and say, oh, I'll get to that later. I have dishes to do. And we forget that play is what helps us learn. So as you go about these last few weeks of classes, you engage in those crucial final research papers, and you print out that one last draft for your English class. I have to ask you, what games do you play? Thank you.
Friendly feedback, Nathan Hoston.
Okay, I hate feedback. And I get a lot of it. I get it from my mom, my advisor. My roommate does this thing where he leaves like Post-it notes on my mirror, and it just like sucks. I hate it. I hate feedback so much that even this speech, the one that you're listening to right now, I got feedback via email 5 days ago. I looked at that feedback this morning. I mean, it's true. It's painful. I didn't change my speech, by the way, so I'm sorry, mentor. I think about this one time in undergrad. I got this essay back, and I got an appallingly low grade on the essay, and right next to it just said, go to the writing center. I didn't go to the writing center, and I also didn't look at the rest of the comments, because in that moment, I became that appallingly low grade. When I get negative feedback, I like turn into that negative feedback. And that's always happened for me up until about 2 years ago. When I was an assistant director of this program, the summer school program, I was teaching high school students how to teach middle school students. This is my first time in this position, so there was a lot of room for growth for me. So there was a lot of opportunities for feedback. My boss at the time, Heidi, would deliver feedback in such a way that actually surprised me. When she gave me feedback, it made me feel like sunshine. So I spent the next 2 summers trying to synthesize the way that she gave feedback into a method that I now use with teachers that I'm coaching. So these are the 3 steps. First, Heidi, when she would give me feedback, would always check for clarification. Did I understand the feedback that she was giving me? Second, she would always check my capacity. Was I able to implement that feedback on my own? And next, she would simply ask, did you need help, Nathan, with that feedback? So I want to apply it to something very practical, very real to my teacher candidates. Currently, I'm a teacher coach in the special education department within the College of Education. And I have about 5 teachers on my caseload, and I love them all dearly, but they all have a really hard time turning in their lessons 24 hours before I go to observe them. So this is how I would use Heidi's method to deliver feedback about getting those darn lessons into me. I would ask first a clarification question and take on some of that responsibility for myself. I would go say something to the effect of, I'm not sure if I was clear. I sort of need those lesson plans 24 hours before the observation. And then I would go into a capacity question. Now, do you have the tools? Do you need anything from me to complete this lesson? And then I would ask just simply if they needed help from me. And usually, I mean, sometimes I'll like give them like my time and say, I will text you 25 hours before you need to get that lesson to me if you need that. Now, this does two things. First, it opens feedback up to a conversation. And second, it gives them the space to accept, challenge, adapt feedback on their own terms. Because this talk isn't actually really about those 3 steps that Heidi gave me. It's about making feedback a conversation. It's about making it collaborative. Because I believe that if you're able to make feedback more engaging that way, that you will make other people feel that feeling of sunshine. Thank you.
Values Division, Natalia Esquivel Silva.
I'd like to take everyone back to my freshman year entering college when I wanted to be an engineer. And then I started at the University of Washington and I wanted to pursue dental school. And then a couple of months after, I wanted to pursue nursing. And that continued on for about 2.5 years. I didn't end up pursuing any of those careers. I am an education major. And as I reflect, I think about all the places where I was lost and all the places where I wasn't lost. So where I was lost was connecting those dots. And the funny thing is that I knew everything that I liked. I knew what values I had. I like to help people. I like to share resources. I like to engage with others. But I didn't know how to connect that into a specific major, into a specific job title, into a specific program. And so thankfully, amazing advisors that helped me in college, I found a new major called Education, Communities, and Organizations. There's a lot of us here today, ECO. And the thing is that the way it happened with me is an uncommon thing. So this major came up at the time in my college career where I was the most confused. And that doesn't happen to a lot of people when they're confused. It's this perfect major that combines a lot of things that you are interested in. That's not going to happen to a lot of people. And far too often this happens to students, and this ends up making them lose their motivation in what they want to do. Specifically with first-generation students, they don't have parents that they have parents, but they may not have had any other career preparation that they can share with their kids. And a lot of us in college, we want to impress our peers. We want to pretend we have everything figured out. And it's great if you do, and it's great, but if you don't, and if you didn't ever, I encourage people to share their stories. In ECO, we talk a lot about being vulnerable. And so this way, if we normalize this, we can help students understand that it's okay to figure it out as you go. And as a future advisor, I hope to be a transparent mentor, because I think that those are the type of mentors that helped me the most. The ones that were like, okay, let's talk about this real talk. Like all these fancy words, I know all these theories we talk about in class. So if there's any recommendation that I can give to other first-generation students who have experienced this or may be currently experiencing this, I would say that it's really hard to, as a first-generation student, to not listen to parents because of all of the respect that you have for their desires, and also from my family as an immigrant family. You really want to value what they wanted you to be. If they wanted you to be a lawyer, if they wanted you to be a doctor or an engineer. But I would encourage students to listen to what they already know. You already know what you enjoy, and try to follow something that excites you. And you will always find, if you carry your values with you, you will always be able to get to your end vision. That's all. Thank you.
Check your blind spot of bias, Roxana, Chiappa, Baros.
imagine. You are wondering what I'm going to ask you to imagine. Dissertation is done. Ideal world, and those that you love academia have achieved an amazing position in a very prestigious university. You have a position of power, and you're invited by the dean to recruit new faculty members. 100 CVs are over the table. That number sounds big, but actually it's quite accurate today. And those that we are applying for positions, we know that. I wanted to imagine and think, what are the criteria that you're most tempted to look at? Think for a second. Prestige of PhD granted university where people graduated? Recommendation letters? What about the number of publications? I have asked this question around 100 times to different professors in Mexico, Chile, Denmark, and also in the US. Chile has been my fieldwork, so I'm going to talk a lot about today. The answer is pretty similar. People don't look at one criteria. They look several criteria. And when I have asked, do you consider that the process of faculty hiring has any bias? What do you think that they say? No, of course not, right? It's very objective. But they have said something that is very important, and they have pointed me out a very important question. They say, we don't have explicit bias. So what about the implicit or the less visible bias, or those bias that we have naturalized, accepted? I'm going to give you 3 examples where I have seen these cases. The first one, a university, very prestigious university, located in Santiago, decided not to disseminate the job opening publicly. They have a hard time recruiting people. So they relied in their professors' network. Professors were highly internationalized, so they didn't have problems to recruit good candidates. When I asked them, do you think that your process has any type of bias? They neglected that the fact that you are selecting people from your own networks would have implications to exclude other people. A very common example in all of the countries that I mentioned. Universities that are very prestigious and receive a number of curriculums, those 100 that some of you professors may have had to analyze. They decided that the pre-screening would exclude anybody that graduated from a university that was less ranked than their own institution. Are you familiar with that situation? The reason why they were doing that was efficiency. You have 200 curriculums. What are you going to do with those? Again, the same question. Do you consider that the process of faculty hiring has any bias? Third example, and that is very common in any process of recruitment. People, after they pass all of their academic filter, academic criteria, faculty evaluate the personality of the prospective candidates. And the question is, what are you looking in the personality? The answer is very ambiguous. They are concerned about feelings in the way that how well that person looks like would it fit in my department. I am pointing all of these criteria because Chile is a very segregated country, and those that are able to participate in networks, selective networks of professors, are a minority. Those that are able to go to the best universities are very associated with the advantages that they had when they grew up. And I care about this because I grew up in a place like this, listening that education will liberate us. And I came to the United States with that question. Can the accumulation of knowledge actually eliminate the barriers? And what I am finding is that no, it's not just about access of higher education or accumulation of the number of PhD holders that can be in a country. There are internalized bias in gatekeepers that are crucial to eliminate. And those that are in a position of power, it's very important to check our unconscious bias. Thank you so much.
Hi all, I just want to say Thank you so much to all of our presenters, my co-organizers. We are so excited that you all were able to participate, and thank you for everyone that showed up, and all of the faculty mentors. We would love for you all to stick around. We'll have food and some beverages available, and engage with the presenters, and stick around for some good chats. Thanks.
Yeah, you did great. Here, I can grab it. Great, I got it.
Oh my gosh, I have to go.